The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or good morning to everybody. Welcome to today's WAN-IFRA webinar. I'm Dean Roper, the head of our Insights department here in Frankfurt. And joining us today is our special guest, Jesper Laursen, who is the CEO of the Native Advertising Institute in Denmark. And as I'll tell you more later, today's webinar is based on the survey and report that WAN-IFRA did with the Native Advertising Institute. It was a global survey, and we wrapped that up in December. And that's what Jesper is going to talk to us a bit about today. Before we get started, just a few things on our side. We have some webinars coming up in the next few months. Unfortunately, we do not have some dates nailed down, but coming up next month, we have our from the World Editors Forum, Trends in Newsrooms this year. The report is broken up into a series of reports, actually. And the first one is almost finished, and it's focused on audience engagement and community journalism. So we will have a case study from that report coming up, hopefully just before our Congress. Then in June, we will have one of our colleagues from CINO International. CINO International is a market research company that specializes also in panels. And they worked with WAN-IFRA on a global ad trust survey. And the survey results are in. The report and the survey will be unveiled at our World News Media Congress. More on that in a minute. And then, of course, our annual World Press Trends survey and report is also in the works, and that will also be unveiled at the Congress. And we will talk about that with Francois Nell, who's working on that, probably in July. But keep an eye on our webinars in the events, WAN-IFRA.org, right? And then for two big events coming up, just next week, I believe, is Publish Asia. That'll be in Singapore this year. It's the annual event of the region, so they have a great program set up. If you're in that region, you should check it out. And then at the beginning of June, again, we have the World News Media Congress this year in Glasgow from the 1st through the 3rd of June. That is a marquee event in the sense that WAN-IFRA presents a number of initiatives that we've been working on across the spectrum of activities we have. And of course, advertising is one of those topics that will be on the program as well. So today's webinar, as I mentioned, is based largely on the findings of our global survey and report that we did with the Native Advertising Institute. There are a few narratives floating around in the industry right now, depending on different perspectives. Some will even tell you advertising itself is dead, that there's no future in it for publishers, and that everybody should focus on consumer revenue and get on with it right now. But I would say with 41% of publishers' overall revenue still coming from advertising around the world, that comes from our World Press Trends data last year, with that much revenue at stake, I don't think it's so black and white as just advertising is dead and move on. I would say just the opposite. It's very much alive, especially for those publishers' business. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the short term, midterm, and long term, focusing on improving that ad experience, the user experiencing, while also transitioning to a more consumer revenue and a diversified revenue stream. And clearly, a part of that ad experience and user experience lies with native advertising. Now, something that Jesper will probably tell you today is that even though native advertising has been around for quite some time, it's actually still a nascent concept and strategy. But increasingly, it is more important for publishers, as our survey and our report shows. So, about the report, WAN-IFRA members can download the report here at this address. That's www.wanifra.org/native_ads/report. You can also download the report at the Native Advertising Institute website that I believe Jesper probably has some more information about. If you are not a member, contact me, or if you're a member and you don't have a report, you can send an email to me and I'll be happy to send you the report. So here are just a few things that Jesper will talk about today. He's a pro in native advertising and content marketing. In fact, he founded the Native Advertising Institute in 2015 and is serving as its CEO. He's one of those rare guys who is a journalist, has worked as a journalist, but as he would say on his LinkedIn account, he is a journalist and an entrepreneur at heart. That is music to publishers' ears when that happens. But he's also involved in other content marketing activities and with his brand movers and media movers businesses as well. So before we hand over to Jesper, I wanted to tell everybody that's listening, and by the way, we have quite a few attendees from all over the world. We have people from Brazil, from India, from Germany, from Denmark, from the Netherlands. So it's a very international audience. So again, thank you for attending. And to be involved, you have an opportunity to give Jesper some of your questions. On your panel on the right, there is a field where you can type in questions, and I will get to those as quickly as possible, and we'll ask Jesper to tackle some of those questions. And just so you know, when we do these webinars, we're recording them. So this recording will go on our YouTube channel and will be there. But after the webinar, we will do a summary, sort of a takeaways, and everybody that's attending or has registered will receive that email along with the takeaways. And we will hopefully get that to you within the next couple of days. So without further ado, I'm going to do that nervous moment of handing over my screen to Jesper. Okay. Jesper, I hope you have it, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
The audience.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Good. Perfect. So do you want me to take it from here, Dean?
Yes, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. So we're going to be talking about the report, Native Advertising Trends in News Media. Let me see if I can get that right. I'm going to first just give you a very extremely short introduction to native advertising, or just at least the definition, so that you know where I'm coming from. We're going to go into 3 sections of the latest research, which is something about the publisher's attitude towards native advertising, about sales and services, so how do they provide native advertising, and then finally around the budgets. And then hopefully I'll have time to just run through 5 keys to success at the very end. And so if you have any questions along the way, like Dean said, just fire away, and maybe we'll see if we can get time to cover something as we go along, or if not, there'll be time at the end as well. So those are like the 3 sections that we're going to be covering. Just before we jump into it, a couple of words about ourselves. The Native Advertising Institute is a global think tank solely dedicated to native advertising. We publish different types of content. Of course, we have a substantial blog. We do research like the one we're talking about today. We have a podcast called the Native Advertising Powerhouse, really about how publishers can build a native advertising studio or brand studio. We also do consulting for publishers in terms of helping them build those, get started with native advertising and build an in-house studio. Then we have the Native Advertising Awards, and every year in November in Berlin, we have the world's largest conference on native advertising. I think we had attendees from 42 countries last year. So that's just a little about our activities at the Institute. Now, as for the definition of native advertising, you'll see many different shapes and forms around the web. But because essentially native advertising is paid advertising, where the ad matches the form, feel, function, and quality of the content of the media in which it appears. And they're all equally important, but I think the quality is oftentimes something that people tend to forget. So it needs to be just as good as the rest of the content of the media. And there are some main channels for native advertising. If you see to the left, you have traditional media, which is, traditional publishers, both online and offline. You'll see it in social media. So all the sponsored posts on Facebook. We have this very, rapidly growing area of influencers, and then programmatic in the sense of Outbrain or Taboola as the recommendation widgets, for example. And then, of course, we have multiple different ones like different kinds of apps, or there are many different things, but those are the main channels. So that was just a few words on native advertising, not to have a discussion on that, but the definition at least. All right, so it's time to jump into the research itself. And again, if I'm going too quickly, or if there's something you want to ask, just shoot Dean an email and he'll interrupt me and get me to go back. So one of the things, like Dean said, you can download the full report both at WAN-IFRA, but also at the nativeadvertisinginstitute.com. It has different, it's quite substantial, but there is a section around publishers' attitudes towards native advertising. And one of the questions we asked him was, how likely are you to use native advertising as an advertising or service option? And you'll see that 56% of the publishers are already offering native advertising. Now, this is the third year consecutively that we've done this report. Last year, 51% of publishers were offering native advertising. We see a growth in the number. And also there are another 11 and 31% that are most likely or likely to start offering native advertising. So it is something that more and more publishers are putting on their plate. Like Dean said at the beginning, advertising is definitely still a very important revenue stream, and native advertising is a growing part of that. We asked them how important native advertising is to your company, and again, we'll have 53% saying that it is very important, and another 43% stating that native advertising is important, and only 4% to whom native advertising is not important. And again, those numbers up from 42 and 50% consecutively. So again, native advertising, more and more offering it, and it's becoming more and more important to many publishers. I think we're going to see why in a minute when we're talking budgets. And this is an interesting one as well. So we asked them, what are your feelings toward native advertising? And we'll have 89% of the respondents that are positive towards it, 9% are neutral, and then only 2% are negative. Last year, 82% were positive. So we're seeing, we're closing in on 100%, but it's something that we've been seeing for every year, that publishers are becoming more and more positive towards this. Now, there was 127 publishers answering this survey from 45 different countries. And I think an interesting point here is that it's a mix of both editorial, it's all C-level, but it's a mix of editorial C-level people as well as commercial C-level. And I think that historically, editorial staff members have been more hesitant towards native advertising. And there are still some that feel native advertising will destroy journalism even. And it is definitely something to be aware of, the influence that native advertising can have on your publication and your credibility. But I think it's fair to say that if you play by the rules, and we'll have, again, I'll get back to that later on in terms of labeling, but if you play by the rules, we haven't seen any examples really of native advertising hurting journalism. But if you start messing with your credibility and messing with the confidence of the audience, then they will punish you, no doubt about it. But I think what we're seeing, that's also not only from the numbers, but we're talking to many publishers every year. And when we're having discussions, we're usually seeing when publishers are starting out on native advertising, the editorial side of the business are hesitant at first. Whereas the commercial side will be much more eager to get started because they need to save their budgets. But 1, 2, 3 years down the line, we're seeing editorial editors, etc., being more and more positive. And I think it's when they start seeing that it's as long as, again, playing by the rule, they're not seeing very many negative reader reactions. So it's actually something that it's a very clear trend whenever publishers are starting out on this. So publishers are feeling positive about this. Then we have a section on sales and services. I have a few numbers with me, but it's around pricing and how they deliver native advertising when they jump into it. And the first question is, how do you actually provide native advertising solutions? And an interesting fact here is that 45% of the news media in this survey has their own native ad studio. So it's a dedicated, some call it a brand studio or a native advertising studio, different names, but basically sort of an in-house agency dedicated to native advertising. And that number is actually up from 35% last year. Now we do a similar study with FIP, which is the global organization for the magazine industry, and we're seeing not exactly the same numbers, but we're seeing the same trends. So a lot of news publishers are actually establishing those their own native advertising studios, and I think this is very interesting from a revenue standpoint because with advertising, there are some publishers that are doing ads, but not very many. But this is actually somewhere where you're not only selling your inventory in terms of the space in your print or your online publication, but you can actually make money being the creative agency, and that's to most publishers, that's a completely new revenue stream, and also that it's not an easy one. And we find that when we're doing consulting for publishers, but it's definitely, once you get it right, then it's definitely a very positive stream of revenue. And then another interesting fact here is that 39% of the publishers are using their editorial team. And this is something that that's very interesting, especially if you look at that number is actually up from 28% last year. And that's probably one of the things that that most publishers, when you speak to them, are not very fond of, is using their normal journalists. And it's definitely something to be aware of. And you'll see a lot of journalists or who never touch native advertising. So one thing is what the C-level people would think would be all right in terms of their trustworthiness. But there's definitely a potential issue from the staff of writers or journalists, whether or not they want to be involved. But again, 39% are actually using their own editorial team. Of course, there's this huge debate about the division of church and state, and it's absolutely something to be aware of. But if you are a publisher that are making, let's say, half your money from advertisers, then you do have some sort of if not dependency, then you at least it's on your radar. And doing native advertising shouldn't necessarily be any different. But of course, if you start using your staff writers, that might be different. Something to consider. But at least a native ad studio is definitely something on the rise. Then we asked them, how do you price native advertising versus traditional advertising? I think that's one of the numbers that is very interesting as well. 69% are charging more for, let's say, a one page with native advertising as opposed to one page with traditional advertising. And only 17% are charging less and 14% the same. And that number of 69 is actually up from 65%. So we're seeing more than 2/3 are charging more for native advertising, and more and more publishers are actually able to charge more. So I think that's again something to look at. If maybe traditional advertising revenue is down, then this could definitely be something. Like I said before, you can make money being a studio doing the creatives, but you're actually oftentimes able to charge more for this advertising.
Jesper, just a quick
Sure.
question. Is that based on the quality of the content more so than the cost of producing that? What is the rationale for the higher price?
So this price is without the studio revenue. So if you this is actually just for the space itself.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the, if you look back like 4 or 5 years ago, when we looked in the magazine industry, for example, we were actually seeing some of them being able to charge 4, sometimes 5x, 5x the amount of money for a one page or a two page, with native advertising. That it's definitely lower now. So you might be having, be able to charge 25% more. We're not seeing that much. But the reason for doing that was that a lot of the readers are responding positively towards native advertising. And we're not talking about they're thinking it's editorial, but the readers who are, completely aware of that this is a piece of advertising, but they're responding much more positively towards it. And that is something that publishers are leveraging, and it's something definitely to be, look, we all need to find, new sorts of revenues. And I think it's something that the publishers that are going into native advertising should have a clear strategy on. That should definitely try to put a stake in the ground saying this is worth more than traditional advertising. And then off top, you might have additional revenue if you're creating the actual piece that goes in. Mm-hmm. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Yep.
Perfect. All right. And so we also asked them, do you have a dedicated sales team for native advertising? And this is also worth a deep dive, not today, but at a different point, because we're seeing a lot of different variations. But right here, we're having 24% that has a dedicated sales team for native advertising, 67% where it's part of the normal day business of the sales team. Oh, and we're seeing every type of combination where sometimes it's the journalists that are the salespeople. Sometimes the journalists are part of the sales. And now I'm usually talking about the native advertising journalists, usually not the editorial staff writers. But and sometimes they're part of the process, and sometimes it's strictly a job for the salespeople. But anyway, this is how they, on average, organize. Now let's take a look at the budgets here. I could just have this one slide, and then do nothing more, because we've been doing this study for the past 3 years, so since 2016, 17, and 18. And when we asked them in 16, so what was the average native advertising share of the total ad revenue? So out of your total ad revenue, how much was native advertising? In 2015, on average, it was 11%. 1 year later, that number was up to 18%. 2017, 1 year later, it was up to 19.5. And then if we jump 4 years, last year's study, we asked them, how much of are you expecting native advertising to be in 2021? So in 2021, and it was up 35%. So publishers on average are expecting native advertising to be 35% of their total ad revenues by 2021. We're already seeing some publishers that are getting 50, 60, 70% of their ad revenues from native advertising. But on average, by 2021, they're expecting 35% to be native advertising. So those are decent numbers for sure. And again, going back to just to have something to benchmark against, it's on the magazine industry, it's even higher, but we're seeing the same trajectory. These where we're asking the brand side, so the advertisers, and they are looking at same numbers. I mean, not necessarily 35% of their entire ad spend, but it's definitely the same trend that we're seeing. So it's not only publishers wishing for this to happen; it's actually advertisers willing to do so. Just a very quick anecdote: we were approached about a month ago by a very large advertiser in Italy who wanted to put on a conference talking about native advertising, and they wanted to invite the publishers because they were ready to buy native advertising, but the publishers apparently didn't have it on their radar yet. So that's an extreme example of advertisers actually being ready to spend money on native advertising, and publishers not always being ready to accept those money. Anyway, just that's anecdotal. We asked them, what is your biggest challenge regarding native advertising? I'm not going to go through all of these, but just going back to the point in terms of the sales team, do you have a dedicated team or not? The second biggest challenge is training your sales team. And as you said at the beginning, Dean, I mean, it's been around for a long, long time, more than 100 years, in fact, if we look at some of the earliest types of native advertising. But if we look at it from a modern standpoint, it's still a very nascent industry. And then training your sales team to this new discipline is a very big challenge for many publishers. And so is explaining native advertising to advertisers, number 3. A lot of publishers are struggling it's very much about educating the market. Not all are so fortunate as the publishers in Italy, where they have actually advertisers willing to spend sooner than they're willing to sell. But it is like, what is native advertising? And it ties very much into number 1, convincing advertisers to tell real stories. So obviously it's not enough if you want to make an impact, if you want to have long-term success with this, both as a publisher but also as an advertiser. It's not enough just dressing a sales message up as an article with a headline and a body of text and then calling it an article. It needs to be something that is actually relevant and valuable in itself to the readers or the viewers. So it needs to be real stories. You can't just pretend, because the audience is gonna see through that straight away. And best case scenario, they're just gonna not look at it. Worst case scenario, they're actually gonna have a negative experience with both the advertiser and the publisher. So it's crucial for publishers to convince the advertisers to tell real stories. But as you can see here, it's also one of the biggest challenges. And I'm sure that most publishers who've tried this are seeing advertisers saying like, but could we please have our name in, every other sentence? That's just, that's not effective. So one of the biggest challenges. I'm just going to go very big before we jump into questions through 5 keys to success, which is based on what we're seeing in the report, but also again based on the many publishers that we work with every year. And the first key to success is to be strategic around this, and by that I mean, I just put this picture in by Meredith from New York Times, is to have it to have buy-in and have it a sponsor at the very C level of the organization. This is, if you want to have, if a publisher, if you want to have success with this, it cannot be like 2 junior salespeople somewhere in the organization teaming up with an intern writer and then betting for success. It's not going to work. It needs to be core. I'm not saying this should be your primary strategy as a publisher, to your point in the intro, Dean, but you need C-level to be in on it, to be championing this and to be serious about this. And then there needs to be a clear strategy on what is the position in the market. Are you going to be competing against other agencies outside your own platform, like on Facebook, for example, or even on other publishers' platform? Or are you going to stay strictly to your own platforms? What type of offering do you want? But it needs to be strategic. So that's a very important point. Second one is being ambitious. I mean, this is probably one of the biggest opportunities, you know, the publishing industry have seen for decades. It's actually it's a completely new set of revenues if you do it right. So there are good reasons to be ambitious around this, and by that, just as an example, Bonnier News. Bonnier has a news brand studio, which is, there are more than 50 people now, and they have like so many different types of people on their team, and they've been very ambitious from the beginning and saying like, we want to create a world-class agency, and they won last year's Native Advertising Award for plus 20 agency, and they've from the very beginning, and they've been willing to invest in this, very ambitious. And then speaking of agency, you know, I mean, maybe these guys are not there anymore, and they're a dying breed. But fact of the matter is that if you want to play this native advertising game, then you will need to act as an agency. You cannot just, I mean, a journalist by heart is not, and I'm a journalist myself, so I know. I mean, journalists are not service-minded people. I mean, that's not what we were, you know, put into this world to be. But if you want to deliver native advertising services to an advertiser, helping them to drive real business value, you need to learn how to act, to understand their business, and to act the way other agencies are doing, because those are the ones that you're going to be working alongside them as well, like media agencies, even advertising agencies could be combined efforts. But if you don't start acting like an agency, then you're not going to succeed in the long run. And then you need to be persistent. I mean, this is a marathon, and by that I mean you can't just put it on your product page and then expect, even though like I showed you before, the numbers are growing, but it's growing with publishers that are being serious about this. And it takes time to train your salespeople. It takes time to understand what kind of native advertising does your audience react to? And are there advertisers that it's not the right fit for? How do you sell this? It's a new discipline for many publishers, and it takes time to get it right. So you need to be persistent. And then finally, last point is you need to be transparent. I mean, news media have, you know, most of you all have been spending decades and decades building your trustworthiness with the audience. And it's easy to jeopardize that. So in this report, we asked them, how do you label native advertising? There are many different variations, most popular one being sponsored content. But this is an interesting point. 8% of the news media, and that's on a global scale, in the US, in Europe, Africa, everywhere, is 8% do not label native advertising at all. I mean, not even like by using a different look and feel. The readers are simply not able to see the difference. Now, that number is actually down from 11% last year, but the year before that, it was 10%. So it seems to be a somewhat stable number around 8–10%. And that is something that needs to change. I mean, that you need to be, and there is actually no reason for hiding this. I mean, the studies are showing that the audience, if it's good, if it's real story, if it's content that brings value to them, they're perfectly happy with it being from a brand. Just as, you know, and let's say it's a supermarket, and they have some good recipes. That is equally valuable to the audience, you know, as something that was invented by the journalists. So if you do it right, they're perfectly happy with it, and there's absolutely no reason to hide where it's from. So those would just be 5 keys to success. Just on a final note, we have this. I just wanted to make sure that you got this promotion code if you want to come join us in Berlin. There's a promotion code you can use. We like you 19, and you get 100 euros off your ticket. So that was just an offer. If you want to learn more about this, put this thank you page on. But in fact, if there's any questions, we'll stay here on this. So that was all for me for my presentation, Dean.
Okay, Jesper, that was really interesting. Thanks so much. Just going back, if you could go back to that slide, the last slide you had, yeah, that one. This question jumped out to me. By using look and feel 28%, do you think does that also mean that they could be labeling, or they're completely relying on the look and feel of the content to convey this is native advertising?
From what the reason why I'm pausing is we've seen so many variations.
Yeah.
And that is everything from, there are some publishers who are actually, and this is interesting fact, they're starting to migrate their traditional supplements from an editorial supplement into a native ad supplement. So it could be their housing section, for example, or their traveling section. Mm-hmm. And then what they would do is they would change the look and feel slightly, and then put ad supplement, for example, on the front page of that specific supplement. Mm-hmm. And then the rest would just be a slightly different look and feel, but it wouldn't have any label on it other than sometimes very different look and feel, sometimes slightly different look and feel. Mm-hmm. So that would be one variation, but honestly, we've seen it all.
But a question for you though is it a mistake not to label it something?
Yes, I mean,
not just relying on, hey, this is a different font, or this is a different, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, so it's one of the questions that when I speak publishers events or conferences or even online, one of the questions I get asked the most is like, how should we label it? And it really depends on the specific audience that you have, and the best way is actually to test it out. So for example, if you want to use a different look and feel, invite some of your audience in and test it out. Like, when are they able to see the difference? How different should it look for them to be able to see that this is something other than the normal editorial content? And again, should it be like a font size 8 or 10 or 12, or how big should it be? And the best answer is really test it out. So should you both have a different look and feel and a label on it? If that's what it takes for a satisfactory percentage of the audience to be able to see that this is native advertising, then yes, you should. If you're seeing like 80% of the audience are able to differentiate the two just by the different look and feel, maybe colors and so, then that might be good enough for you. But best way is to test it out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Some of our audience obviously are from local and regional publishers around the world, and we have a question. Of course, we see about like Bonnier, Sheepstead, New York Times, a lot of these larger publishers that have set up their own studios. What does native look like in some of the smaller local regional publishers in the terms of the organization and strategy around creating a studio versus getting an external agency? Can you say anything on that?
Yeah, so that's when we do the podcast, for example, that's one of the questions that I asked all the guests is like, what would your first 5 hires be? And even 5 hires can be a lot for many publishers, regional or national or what have you. Mm-hmm. And so if trying to summarize what the most important thing would be is you would need one anchor person to run the show, if you will, someone who really understands native advertising. And then you should ideally have an editor on board. And then, so those would be the first two. And then you might have a dedicated salesperson, or you want it to be anchored in the Salesforce. But those actually, you want a person that understands native, that understands the clients, that can speak to the clients and explain to them what it is. You want an editor to actually be able to create this. And those would probably be the first two. And the rest of it, you can either hire freelancers. So no need to put staff writers on your team before you grow to a certain size. You don't want someone, just to be sitting there and getting paid if you have 3 weeks without any projects. You'll just, you can use freelancers, either the same that you're doing for the normal editorial stuff, or someone who used to work for you, as someone who understands it. Same goes, if you're a publisher who has a lot of video, use external video people. But I think the crucial part was is to get someone that actually understands native advertising. But it's not, and then you can grow it slowly. But Bunny grew slowly. It's rare there are not many publishers who have 50 people on staff.
Wow.
That is something that you might get to in time. What we're seeing mostly is you'll have many publishers, one content person, one salesperson. Those would be the first two.
Can you go to that slide where you had, it was from the survey about, I think it was the creating your own content survey studio.
Sure.
You had the editorial team issue on there, I believe. Yeah.
That one?
Listen, I could ask a lot of questions myself about this, but my first one is the question you mentioned about some publishers are using editorial. How are they doing that? Are they taking journalists from the present editorial team and putting them on a native advertising team purely, or are they using actually the editorial team that continues to do other content, editorial content?
So if you look at the third bar, which is a separate native ad team, that would be if you move someone. Now, no, the editorial team is actually someone who is consistently sitting on the editorial team. Okay. And they'll get that to contribute to this. We've seen many different things. It could be the lifestyle. So let's say you're a publisher with fashion, some element of fashion, then they might do the fashion for some, again, like a department store or a clothing brand. It could be like we've seen like automobile journalists that create some. I mean, obviously there are things you cannot do. I mean, there are things you can't do in native advertising at all. Like let's say Samsung wanted to do a test of flat screens, and oh wow, they came out #1. I mean, you can't do that. And just if you're talking automobiles, you can't do like a credible test of a car. You can't test drive a car if it's paid for. But you might be able to get your normal automobile journalist to talk about, it might be, let's say BMW has an anniversary. You might get one of the traditional journalists to tell the story of BMW. That's some of the things you could see. There are areas where you can't do that, but this is actually editorial journalists where they'll have like a couple of days for creating this and then go back to what they usually do. It's a fine line. I'm not personally. I'm not. I think it's a slippery slope. So you want to be very careful here. But it can work. It does work for some.
Okay. Another question is, with so much demand around video today, also from advertisers, but also from readers as well, how is that playing into the native trends in terms of publishers having to produce more of that? How do you see that going? Is that going to be the medium for native for the future?
Yeah, I think it's growing quickly. I didn't put the slide in here, but we do have one where we're asking what are the biggest opportunities for publishers, and video is in there. What type of that they're offering, and again we can see, like, I think video is definitely growing. quickly, and it's going to be equally big. I think it's brands are producing more and more video. If you see that the consumption of content and video is growing, but I think it's very important to understand that as a publisher going into native, you're selling your platform first and foremost. And if that is a place where people are consuming a lot of video, then it will be big. On the other hand, many publishers still not too big on video.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might not be a big thing for them just yet. I think it's definitely something that we're seeing growing. It's a huge opportunity, and again, you can make a lot of money just creating the videos. But if you're not a publisher who's got video at all in your platform, then it's or very little, it's probably not big. Just the same thing with podcasting. There are some publishers who are big on podcasting, who makes sense to them, and others don't have an audience for that at all. So even though podcasting is growing as well, it might not be interesting at all.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple more questions. This is an easy sort of yes and no, but would you say that you're talking about the creative side, creating an agency, much like Bonnier has? Would you say is it safe to say that native advertising has driven much of that strategy around publishers becoming much more of an agency-minded mindset to offer more diverse solutions?
Oh, absolutely. And the primary reason for that is that this is an area where publishers actually have something that a normal agency doesn't have. Technically, I mean, it's not done overnight, but you can hire people. Let's say a content agency, or that are working exclusively for brands. If you want to mirror that organization, and you can hire that kind of people, but you can always add your audience, which is something that the agencies you're competing against, they don't have it. You haven't actually platform. You can just add 100,000 people or what have you. So native advertising is absolutely something that has woken a lot of publishers, because beforehand, if you just wanted to act as a normal agency, then that's there are a lot of good agencies out there. That's a tough place to be. But if you do it with the outset of your own platform, your own audience, then you have something unique. And I think that's very crucial. I think publishers that are acting as agencies outside their own platforms, you can do that definitely on different platforms, but it's on your own platforms that you have a head start, that because you have the numbers, how your audience reacts and responds to different types of content. That's a unique knowledge to leverage that nobody else can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, last question. You mentioned the challenges around sales training. Can you give an example, anything, insight to what are one or two of the challenges you see around getting sales up to speed on selling native?
Yeah, so it depends a little. I mean, if and again, it depends on your sales staff, obviously, but if you're talking, let's say a series, 5 one-page articles
Mm-hmm.
put in your publication, then that's a pretty simple thing to train the salespeople to sell. But as soon as it becomes a little more complex, multi-channel, and as soon as it's a situation where the publisher is actually also creating some of the content and not just offering the space, then that's a more complex project. It can be a much more effective and much more powerful project, but it can be much more difficult for the salespeople to get their head around, because they've never dealt with this. I've been talking to advertising directors for a decade by now, and I remember a lot of time. I mean, even 10, 12 years ago, they were all sitting down and said, we want our salespeople to be consultants. we want them to be able to sit down and have a conversation with advertisers on what are their business goals, what do they want to achieve. Fact of the matter is, I've hardly ever seen that happening, because the conversation that you had just wasn't there. With native advertising, you can actually have that conversation. You can actually be a consultant that is, advising on platforms even beyond your own, but it is difficult, and that takes time to train your salespeople. And some of the things that we're seeing is sometimes that the people building the native ad unit or driving that are sometimes a little too ambitious, a little too um, um, how do you say, impatient.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not realizing that this is not salespeople. And funny thing is, when we have our conference in Berlin in November, we have around, last time we had 500-600 people from 40-something countries, and tons and tons of publishers are coming. But it is most oftentimes it's not the salespeople coming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because the creatives are like, this is interesting, this is exciting, and we're not seeing the salespeople there. And you need to educate those salespeople. It's not something that you can just go out and do.
Yeah.
It's easier to create a piece of content for a native ad than it is to understand and sell it as a bigger project. But but once you get it right, the opportunity is massive. Once you get it right.
Sure. Okay, that's a good way to wrap this up. So Jesper, thanks so much. It was very insightful. We here at WAN-IFRA, of course, look forward to working with you on the upcoming survey for the end of this year, and we'll look forward to sharing that with all of you as well. So thanks to Jesper, and thanks to all of the attendees. Once again, we will have a summary of the webinar that we will email to you with the takeaways and the recording and link to our YouTube channel with the webinar on there as well. And if you, again, would like to get your hands on the report, you can email myself or Jesper, and we'll get you the report. Okay, everybody, look forward to hearing from you and attending a webinar soon. Jesper, thanks again. Everybody, have a nice day.
Sure. Thank you.